Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and director of the Real Estate Academy of America. And today's video is how to fill in the buyer compensation paragraph in the Georgia Association of Realtor forms. So there are three forms where a buyer, the compensation that a buyer pays to their broker for professional services rendered is all spelled out in writing on the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, the non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, and the customer agreement to work with broker as a buyer. So these forms, well, not these forms, but well, I guess these forms and these compensation paragraphs in these three forms have been revised by the Georgia Association of Realtors as of July 1st, 2024. So this is August 2024, and I just want to do a brief walkthrough of how to fill out those paragraphs. So let me share my screen and we will get started. So the compensation paragraph for buyers in those three forms: exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, which is form F110, non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreement F113. Those are the documents that you would sign if your buyer wants to be a client of your broker. And the compensation paragraph is the same in form F116, agreement of buyer to work with broker as a customer. That would be the form if your buyer wants to be a customer of your broker. By the way, in Georgia, if a buyer fails to sign a brokerage agreement, they are by default a customer. So the compensation paragraph is the same. Just want to walk through how to fill it out. Now, for any specifics regarding what your broker allows you as an agent to negotiate with the buyer, you need to check with your broker's policies. So compensation is negotiable and not set by state law. However, brokers do have policies regarding those negotiations. So let's get started. The first section, the paragraph, is compensation for professional services of broker. In Georgia, we have had this disclosure in our forms for several years. This is a new title to the paragraph, but compensation commission paid to a buyer's broker by a broker has been in our agreements, in the brokerage agreements, for several years. So paragraph A states generally, compensation to brokers is negotiable and not set by state law. However, this does not obligate individual licensees and brokerage firms to necessarily negotiate their compensation. Actually, let me back up a little bit. There are three ways in which a buyer's broker gets paid. And that is something to keep in mind for all of the compensation forms in the Georgia Association of Realtors contract package. One is a buyer's broker can get compensated directly by the buyer. Number two, a buyer's broker can get compensated from the seller's broker. Number three, a buyer's broker can get compensated directly from the seller. Regardless of how the buyer's broker gets compensated, the buyer still, this information must be disclosed to the buyer, and it must be written out in writing on one of these three buyer forms: exclusive or non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreement or buyer customer acknowledgement. So first paragraph is the same. The second paragraph, compensation to the buyer's broker. The buyer agrees to pay buyer's broker the compensation set forth below at the closing of any contract to purchase, as that term is here and defined. This is the buyer's financial obligation to the broker for professional services. This amount is expressed as either a percent of the sale price, a dollar amount, or other. Now, a couple of things. Per the NAR preliminary settlement, this may not be 0% or $0. And there has been some confusion why there are two fill in the blanks. This first fill in the blank is for words, and this second is for numerals. So you would fill the amount in, spelling it out in words and then in numbers on this first line. The second is for a specific dollar amount, and the third option is for other. Make sure you put a check mark in the box, and you could have one of these two. You could have other along with one of these other two. This amount here in paragraph 4B, this is the amount a buyer obligates themselves to pay your broker, the buyer's broker, at the closing of a transaction. This is the most amount that a buyer will have to pay. Now, let's look at the next subparagraph, paragraph C. Optional compensation from the seller or the seller's broker. The buyer hereby approves or disapproves. Don't leave these blank. Make sure you check one of these boxes. A buyer hereby approves or disapproves of the buyer's broker receiving compensation from the seller or seller's broker. Nothing herein should be interpreted as a promise by the seller or seller's broker to pay or offer to pay compensation to the buyer's broker herein. If, however, the buyer does approve of such compensation being paid by the seller or seller's broker to the buyer's broker, the maximum amount the buyer's broker may receive from the seller's side, whether it be from the seller directly or the seller's broker, is, and again, this amount is expressed as a percent of the sale price, spelled out in words and then in numbers, a flat fee dollar amount, or other. Now, a couple of things in keeping with the preliminary NAR settlement agreement. Don't leave this blank. And this amount is to cover any seller side offered compensation and bonuses. Do not leave this blank, and it may not be open-ended. For example, you cannot put any bonus offered by the seller side or any compensation offered by the seller side. It must be a specific amount or determinable. Now, you could put a percent, or you could put a dollar amount, or you could put something such as bonus not to exceed X amount of dollars, bonus not to exceed X amount of percent. So, well, I'll come back to this in a minute, but don't leave it blank, and it may not be open-ended. And again, this is if the buyer approves. Now, let's look at the next subparagraph, subparagraph D, possible reduction in the buyer's compensation obligation to their broker. Any compensation the buyer's broker receives from the seller or the seller's broker shall, the first box is reduce the compensation the buyer shall pay to the buyer's broker dollar for dollar. The second box is not reduce the compensation buyer shall pay buyer's broker. And the third box are special exceptions to the compensation paid from the buyer to the buyer's broker set forth below. So for some reason, this seems to be confusing. But basically, I have a little cheat sheet for you here, a note. If the buyer agrees that the amount you get from the seller side will reduce what they owe, what you do is you take the amount in B and you subtract C. So this means when it says reduce compensation buyer shall pay buyer's broker is amount in B minus amount in C. So let me walk through this. You're going to fill in an amount or a percent of the sale price that when a buyer comes to you and says, I want to hire you to help me go buy a house. Your professional services are not free to help a buyer buy a house. You are a professional real estate agent with a license issued to you by the state of Georgia. There is a fee for your services. That fee is whatever, let's just say it's a percent of the sale price. Then you say, okay, buyer, At closing, you're going to owe my broker this amount of money. This is the maximum amount a buyer will have to pay for your professional services of helping them buy a home. However, the buyer may approve that your broker gets paid from the seller side, either from the seller directly or from the seller's broker. If so, what is the maximum amount that your broker, you, the buyer's broker, can get paid from the seller's side? Well, generally speaking, it's going to be at least the same amount as they obligate themselves, or it gets negotiated within your broker's policy that they're going to pay you for services of helping them buy a house. More than likely, it might be more than what, so the amounts in paragraph C, more than likely are going to be greater than the amount the buyer negotiates within your broker's policy in B. Why is that? Well, that would be to cover any potential bonus offered by the seller side. And then if you mark reduced compensation, buyer shall pay broker dollar for dollar, you're going to take the amount in B, subtract amount in C, and that would be the amount your buyer owes at your broker at closing. So if the amount in B is whatever amount, and you are getting paid directly, you're getting compensated, your broker's getting compensated directly from the seller side, either from the seller directly or the listing broker. If the amount you are being compensated from the seller side is equal to or greater than the amount in B, let's just say it's equal to the amount in B, then the amount in B minus the amount you're getting compensated from the seller side, if that equals 0, that's how much your buyer owes you at closing. If there is a bonus being offered, then let's say the amount that you're getting compensated from the seller side is more than the amount that the buyer is obligated to pay. You are only allowed to accept that if the buyer agrees. So the amount in B is the maximum amount the buyer would potentially have to pay if there is no compensation coming from the seller side whatsoever. If there is compensation coming from the seller side, then if they select this box in D, reduce the compensation, you take the amount coming from the seller side and you subtract it from what the buyer owes, and that's how much the buyer would owe. The NAR preliminary settlement says, however, the buyer must agree to the maximum amount you can be paid. So including from the seller side. So again, B is the maximum amount the buyer would potentially have to pay. C, however, is the maximum amount that you could be paid, that your broker could accept from the seller side. So again, I have my notes here to help you, and I'll include this so you can link it down below so you can look at it. But this is how to fill out these sections. Now, please check with your broker for their policies regarding your negotiation of compensation. If you have any questions on how to fill out that amount or those fill in the blanks, and to walk through any specific examples or samples or ideas or questions that you have. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.